And we're back for episode 37 of Pursuing the Perfect Pint podcast. And in today's episode, nowhere to hide behind a lager. And I think this is something Brent and I have spoken about a lot. The seemingly simple lager is probably one of the most difficult things to get right. And as he chats to a very interesting person from the European Brewery Convention around what it means to make a good lager. But before we get into that, Brent, your weatherman hat is back on. And what is he saying?
So I guess, Danielle, heading a little bit into the technical space, which I think is good, and there's lots going on there, and John talks about that, so we can run that. As it pertains to market conditions, we're nearing the end of harvest in Europe, and we're amidst the extended, elongated heat wave that is across most of Europe. So there's definitely been impacts, as I think I've mentioned on this podcast before. Luckily, I think most of the barley in Europe was very well developed before the real brunt of the heat wave hit. So we maybe have squeaked by a little bit on the barley side, but the impacts of the heat wave are certainly there, impacting wheat and definitely impacting corn. So even as we get to the end of barley harvest in Europe, we aren't fully free of weather-related problems, so that is it's likely going to come through from the feed grain corn side of things. So step one, we get the barley crop harvested and in storage and figure out where the quality is. There is some quality variability in some regions, of course, because of the weather. But the secondary part of that is we will see the upcoming year will have greater influences from what I call external markets, from say the corn market or the wheat market. So that's a watch out for people going forward. But that'll happen, I think, once we clear harvest. And of course, the geopolitical situation hasn't changed. It's crude oil's back up, heading towards $100 a barrel again. So we're still seeing this combination of fundamental weather impacts and geopolitical. So stay tuned. I don't think the bumpy ride's over.
No, and I think just for those people who are listening and don't have the map in front of you, I think the map that Brent's got there is the maximum temperature departure from normal. And I think, across most of France, Italy, the UK, you're seeing a departure of 7 degrees hotter than normal. And that's, I think 7 degrees, that's a massive shift from what you would consider normal at that time.
Yeah. Over a 90-day period. So this is this has lasted way longer than anything we've seen before. Certainly my experience in Europe, which is now 16 years. This is widespread and much longer. We always have a week or two of hot weather, but it's been massively different this year.
Yeah, for 90 days, that's true. So as we go into that, Brent, we're thinking about what people are going to be doing with that barley. You had a very interesting chat with John Brauer from Brewers of Europe, and nowhere to hide behind a lager. Let's hear what you chatted about.
Okay. Well, the Pursuit of the Perfect Pint podcast is going to make a little bit of a move this episode. We're going to talk a bit more about the technical side of brewing, and very pleased to have John Brauer here from, I guess you'll introduce yourself, John, and what you do with Brewers of Europe and European Brewing Convention. But I guess, first of all, we recently met in Lisbon and agreed to do this podcast. So first of all, John, thanks for taking some time, and good to see you again. We had some interesting things we touched upon, which we'll carry on, but maybe to start things off, maybe a little bit of your background and what keeps you busy these days in what you do with Brewers of Europe, for example.
Yes, thank you very much, Ben, for those introductory words. And thank you again for having me here on the show this morning. I think there's a lot of enthusiasm from my side as far as technical brewing is concerned in particular, but the brewing industry in itself has been a constant companion in my life, really, for the last 37 years. I started with the former South African breweries at their R&D center in Johannesburg, first with a view to helping with analyses, hop analyses in particular, in this so-called central laboratories. And then after a while, I was asked to join the pilot plant, which I found was more to my liking than being in the laboratory environment. And that was kind of the fast track to eventually then becoming a brewer. I also worked in some of the bigger breweries in the group of South African breweries at that time. Notably, I was the so-called project brewer at the brewery in Port Elizabeth on the coast. Two and a half wonderful years that I wouldn't want to miss in my life. So that's absolutely wonderful. Let's fast track a little bit forward. I've been with the Brewers of Europe since 2008. I was hired as the EBC Executive Officer. EBC, obviously, as you already said, stands for European Brewery Convention. It's a fairly venerable association which was founded in 1947 in the wake of the Second World War, when raw materials were scarce and of bad quality, and brewers were finding that they had also no way of really assessing quality, neither in terms of product, in terms of the beers that they were producing, but also in terms of the raw materials. We didn't know how to analyze malt. We didn't know how to analyze hops. And of course, as the old saying goes, if you can't measure something, you can't really control it. So this is where the EBC had its memorable beginnings. That was in 1947. Our membership base was, however, always very much synonymous with the membership base of the Brewers of Europe, and that's why it was decided early in the 2000s to amalgamate or to merge these two associations, which we eventually did. So I'm now looking back on, I think it's now 18 years that I've been with the Brewers of Europe, and I have only been doing things for the European Brewery Convention, for the EBC. So I do all the brewing technical stuff, but I'm very much assisted by my colleague who's doing more the regulatory aspects. And of course, again, regulatory is a lot of legalese. It's a lot of legal aspects, but at the same time, you need to understand your brewing process. And I think that's where I've been able to make a little bit of a difference.
Yeah, great. So a very rich history, John, and I guess it doesn't hurt to have, because I know you speak good Deutsch, and having the last name Brauer is quite, it was kind of destiny in a way. So I think that fits quite nicely. And the last couple of points you made, John, I guess around the technical aspects and process controls and so on. I guess that's some of the work you're ongoing. And we had the discussion, as we mentioned recently in Lisbon, and I made the comment to you. I think what I see, and I would like to get your comments, that we've seen the industry in general has just matured in a way that everyone's process and understanding their process and doing it as close to perfection as you can get has really continued to improve. And the one example was that we've seen a lot of smaller brewers, like if you say craft as an example, that were, started with ales and that was a logical place to start, but they're now moving increasingly into lager and pill style. And what we talked about there's nowhere to hide behind a lager from a brewing process control. Like you have to be completely on top of your game if you're brewing a lager style. So I guess maybe you could comment a bit on that, as how you see that maturation and I guess part of what you do to help people be on top of their process, because of course we want everyone to have a good experience with the perfect pint that they're enjoying. So process control really becomes, a given. You have to be on top of that.
Absolutely, Brent, and I'm glad you sort of gave me the on-ramp onto the topic in terms of certain key aspects like quality, aspects like being in control. I think essentially at the end of the day, I think all of us grew up with this idea or this concept that quality is what we want to do in order to have a good process or a good product, and ideally we want to merge those two in having those two things together. However, we need to also realize that quality is actually only that which is measurable and fit for purpose. That means essentially at the end of the day, you need to say what we want is good quality, or you even welcome to say we want excellent quality. Just to say quality does not infer good. It means fit for purpose. Which means, for example, let's say I'm somebody brewing beers for a discounter market, and I have a very tight budget, and a bottle of beer cannot retail for more than, let's say, 80 euro cents in a discounter. I am prepared to make to basically come to kind of a sweet spot in terms of bringing the quality down a little bit, but where I can control it. But at the end of the day, I know that my quality is not the best, but it's predictable. And I think that's what many brewers don't actually realize. It doesn't always have to mean the best. It needs to mean that the product is in such a way consumable by your consumers, and that the consumers don't complain, essentially. And I think that's just something that is very important. But having said that, if I'm in a sort of a mixed group of technical people and marketeers in the brewing industry, and I talk to people about premiumization, I always realize it means something completely different to marketeers, because the big tool of marketeers is really the good narrative. It's the nice stories that go with the product, with our ambiance that we are trying to foster. But it doesn't mean to say necessarily that we actually changing our brand. We might just keep the brand the same, but give it a bit of a facelift in terms of packaging, in terms of labeling, in terms of even advertising could be enhanced in such a way towards premiumization. But that's not the kind of stuff that I'm talking about. That's not the kind of premiumization that I, as a technical brewer, would understand to be kind of giving you the results. What I'm talking about is the time-proven important things that we as brewers do, looking after our raw materials. I still believe that without good raw materials, you don't get a good product. But what's even more important is actually, I think, not just the raw materials, but how do you process them? In other words, what is equally important, if not more so, is to actually premiumize your available technologies. And that could actually mean it's going to be more expensive. It could take more time, and time is money, as we know. But it could also mean that in some ways it's not congruous or goal directed with our achievements in terms of sustainability. Let me give you an example. If I make a lager beer, and of course, as you said, lager beers are naked beers. They're not very forgiving as far as processing is concerned, and faults. And if this is a standard lager and I leave it for another 3 weeks in cold storage for added time of maturation, I think by now we have evidence, analytical evidence, that is actually a great way to premiumize your beer, but it does come at a cost, as these things normally do. So whatever you do in terms of premiumization, don't just look at your raw materials. Of course, you look at your raw materials as well, but you also need to look at the best available technologies that you want to employ to basically get from like a score of 92% to about 95%. Doesn't sound like much, but as you know, it gets harder as you get to the top.
It's in a way, John, is get the most out of those raw materials. So number one, understanding what it is, and understanding, I guess, the variability, which goes back to some of your beginnings. That's in the world of hops or malt. Every crop is a little different. So number one, you have to understand what's the change for this year's malt is what I would be closer to versus previous years. Understanding that, but then you're saying through the brewing process, what is that you want to achieve from it? And how do you get the most out of those raw materials, no matter what Mother Nature has thrown at you? So it's a
Yeah, yeah.
dynamic thing, and I guess that's where you help a lot of your people that you connect with in moving that forward. You gave one example as well. Maybe that you could take it further. Is you looked at the aging of beer, and you looked at a specific project you talked about around the dehusking of malt and what the long term. So then you're getting into the deep science, which we don't want to cover in huge detail, but I guess you could touch upon that as one example of how you've gone into the details to say what could you do to have that best outcome possible for the consumer experience.
Yeah, absolutely, Brent. There are, various examples that we could discuss at length, but obviously we want to concentrate on only certain aspects. The idea of having husk in your brewing process is obviously an old one, and it's a very vital one. If we don't have the husk from the malt, we're finding it quite difficult to actually lauter or separate your mash into a liquid phase and more of a solid phase. We all know that, but what is it actually that happens? Is there a like an optimal ratio of grist, in other words, starch, to husk material? We never ask these questions really because we normally just take the malt, we grind it up, and then we basically extract it with hot water. I mean, that's really, to put it in a very blunt
Simple terms.
and basic nutshell, that's really what it is. But that's not really what I'm talking about. I think what we need to realize also is that the husk itself was not created by Mother Nature primarily as a filter bed. It was created to house enzymes in the aleurone layer, just under the husk, and so basically that husk is very important in the conversion of the starch. Now, beginning of the 20th century, there was a German brewmaster who was getting fed up with the quality of the malt he was getting. And don't forget, in those days, a lot of brewers had to use 6-row malts simply because, the barley breeding efforts hadn't progressed to that stage. And two-row malt was actually a premium. And so he realized that if he was using 6-row barleys, often that resulted in harsh and after-bitter tastes of his beer. And he realized it was because it was too much husk material.
Yeah, and I guess, sorry, John, to interject, I guess for the average listener to this would be generally 6-row kernels are smaller compared to 2-row kernels, which
Exactly.
means physically they have a greater proportion of husk material because they are smaller. So of the total kernel size, a greater proportion is husk. And then if you're using that, then this, what you were just getting into, is you actually have a greater proportion of husk. And if there's any off flavors that come from that.
Exactly. And why this is significant that the guy came from Germany and developed this process, it's called also the Kubessa process, which is basically means husk separation, is because he had no other way of dealing with this. He could have, if he had been living in South Africa or the States or any other European country, he could have actually started using adjuncts which don't have so much polyphenol material, and thereby kind of augment his extract, but successively reduced his input from the husk. He could have done that, and he would have got very similar results, but that door, because of the Reinheitsgebot, the purity law, the German quality manifesto for the brewing industry, that wasn't available to him. And that's why he said, look, I'll keep the husk aside, and then I do my mash, and at 72 degrees, I put the husk back, because then I still get a little bit of a conversion. Then I lauter and I see what I get. And to his surprise, he found, or to his delight, actually, he found that those beers were always very smooth and had showed no trace of afterbitter. So this is why you still get some brewers in Germany who abide by this technology, but often they themselves are not sure and don't have the historical facts that essentially this was based on the fact that they or their predecessing breweries were having to use 6-row malts, barley's malts. In fact, that everybody these days is using 2-row barley. So that kind of fell away, but still, I think there's a lot of merit in addressing those quality issues and the augmentation of quality that results from these technological changes.
Yeah, it's a great example. I guess you say necessity is the mother of invention. So I guess that German brewer had a challenge. He figured out a way that, but if I take the husk out, he still gets the filterability, but he takes away some of those off taste notes.
Exactly. Yeah.
So it's I guess for anyone listening, by thinking differently, there's some things you can come up with that just add to that final experience, is what you started with. So that's a great story. The other topic we wanted to cover before we go towards the end, John, is a lot of, and this would tie in nicely, but there's a lot of work done in the non-alcohol space, and we sampled a few in Lisbon, in fact, and we're seeing that the quality of these non-alcohol products are improving measurably, I would say, and will continue. But maybe you could give a little bit of a brief comment on the non-alcohol space, and how you see brewers are adapting to that growing consumer need for beers that contain 0.5 or less.
Right. Essentially, Brent, we have a situation at the moment where the brewing industry is not exactly that healthy, and that has a lot to do with the demographics. People are not drinking so much alcohol anymore, and the segment of the population drinking alcohol is also diminished because of demographic effects, which means basically nowadays you have I think the figure that I heard, that every 11th or every 13th beer in the European Union now is a non-alcoholic beer, which is fantastic, which is really goes beyond any expectations we would have had. So it's not just a case of providing a choice and non-alcoholic choices to the consumer, but it's also a way to ensure some modicum of growth for our sector. So that's important. And what's helped a hell of a lot is, of course, to have access to modern contemporary technologies like the low pressure evaporations or distillation units. Basically, the philosophy behind all of these technologies is that you can't just take the alcohol out and then expect it to be the same drinkable product. It'll be okay, but something is missing because you've taken something out. And I think that's what these modern technologies are now addressing, is to try and put something back. And typically with this low pressure evaporation, you have a second rectifying column that basically puts the volatiles back into the brew. So you're putting something back which is not alcohol, and that seems to work very well. And it's actually a must for the 0.0 beers, because otherwise they would taste completely empty. It's a slightly different story with the 0.5ers, because there you have the possibility of using what we call maltose negative yeasts and other organisms as well that can greatly help to make not just a good 0.5, but actually a pretty fantastic 0.5% beers, which are legally entitled to be carrying the label non-alcoholic. So that's absolutely fine. So I think what we are seeing is a great way of creating opportunities, growth opportunities as well for our brewers. So not just in terms of new product development, but in terms of finding new markets.
Yeah. And I guess, is it fair to say, and I think it's good that you outlined it that way, John, there's a couple different approaches. The yeast strains that will continue to develop and continue to mature in that sense, and the equipment, as you mentioned, will improve. So we could be quite hopeful that the non-alcohol beers 5 years from now will be even better than the improved improvements we've already seen. So this will just be, it's a journey, of course, but it'll continue, and we should just see those products, because it's important, as you said, because this is where the consumers are, and we have to align as best we can with the consumers. And if they're looking at moderation, then I think we talked about it a lot. It's a huge opportunity for the brewing industry to offer a very natural product in a 0 or a 0.5 form, and back to where we started the conversation, and do it well, fit for purpose, as you said, and deliver a very good experience to the consumer. And if it fits them, they'll come back and have another one. And I guess that's where you can start to see where it would just, then in 5 years, it'll be 3 out of 11 beers will be non-alc, or wherever that trend goes. I think we just need to be ready for it. So I think there's more to be. We'll have to come back and have another discussion on those further enhancements on the non-alcohol space. It's just the biggest growth opportunity. So, but thanks for sharing some of your things on that. Maybe to wrap up, John, I guess we both, separate times, we had an overlap. Perfect Pint, I guess, given our backgrounds, and it's a bit tied to the whole raw material space, having spent some time in Santon, as you did. I said, as we were planning for this, Hansa Pilsner, a very iconic brand in South Africa, in its brand profile, it had a kiss of the Saaz hop, which was actually in the whole brand messaging, was telling you something about the ingredients. I would like it to be a malt story in some form, and we talked about that, of course, at some length. But I think examples like that, to me, start to get us towards the perfect pint. But maybe if you were going to think about what's the perfect pint look like from John Brauer's standpoint, what does the perfect pint look like?
The perfect pint for me would be a lager, because you can, as you said right in the beginning of our discussion, it's a lager is a complex product, but seemingly simple, but it never is simple. And if it's simple, it's boring. So where is the fine line between the boring and where do you enter onto territory of high drinkability and this feeling of lip smacking enthusiasm with a beer? So there are obviously quite a lot of examples, but I would just like to encourage also small brewers to not shy away from making lagers. And funny enough, you find that as our craft beer industry kind of comes to maturity, you find more and more brewers actually small brewers realizing this is a great way to make a highly drinkable product, but it's oh so difficult. And if you just go back 5-6 years ago, there was an absolute plethora of IPAs on the market in all shapes and sizes. But in fact, they were so easy to make because you could cover up all your process faults, your unwanted volatiles. You could hide a little bit of diacetyl away. You didn't have to lager it for so long because nobody would actually pick up the acetaldehyde and so on and so forth. But to me, the ideal pint would be exactly this: a well hopped but completely integrated lager, and preferably something which is clear enough to look like it's been filtered, but ideally one which has stayed in maturation long enough to allow for some natural flocculation and sedimentation of the yeast. To me, that really enhances the drinking experience no end. I think this is the best that brewers can ever hope to do and to achieve. And of course, with a hope that that also increases their flavor stability. And those two aspects don't necessarily go hand in hand. So if we're just taking a snapshot, that's what I would do right now.
And it would come with a load of refreshment, which I think is one of the big benefits of
Yes,
lager pill style.
absolutely.
So, well, John, thanks again for taking some time to share some of your thoughts. There's much more we can talk about, so we'll maybe come back again and we'll go through and talk about some other.
Always happy to have a bit of a discussion. Next time with a beer.
And you might show up at a future RMI event and engage with some of our malt supply people to get that story of malt out to the world as well.
I'm looking forward to that. Thank you.
All the best. Cheers.
Cheers. Thank you very much. Bye-bye.
I think, Brent, it's very interesting the point that John makes about quality is about predictability and what is fit for purpose. And I think one of the things I always think as a supply chain is if a brewer, for example, knows they're getting poorer quality malt, but they know it in advance and they can get it for a period of time, they can adjust to that. I think it's the variations in quality that make it very difficult to work with because then it's not predictable.
Yeah. Well, a couple of things on that subject, Danielle. We've had a lot of discussions over the years on that. I think the first one, I wasn't sure. I thought nowhere to hide behind a lager. There's a bit of provocation in that, but I think basically to me, it's proof that the brewers in general are maturing in their skill set. So nowhere to hide behind a lager means you have to be, and we talked about it in the video, you have to be on top of your process and you have to deliver because there's nowhere to hide in a crisp, clean lager. So that's very good. To your point, Danielle, we had lots of discussions and you beat it into my head repeatedly. If we have a crop with variability, it would be much better rather than say a maltster blending extreme qualities together to get to an average. You would be better off to keep the quality separated and deal with it individually, right? Remember if I said we talked about it 47 times, I'm grossly underestimating how much debate we had over that, but it's actually true. If you know what you're dealing with and you can do some certain things to get the most out of, say, a difficult situation or just that variability, as opposed to when you blend it together. We've had lots of examples where a brewer looks at it and says, I can't understand why my process didn't behave exactly as I thought. Some of that could come from the fact that you got variability inside what on the surface looks like that. So you've converted me, Danielle. I'm totally on board. If I was back in procurement, I would carry that.
There you are. If we could only go back in time. But also the other interesting thing that John said, the whole dehusking of malt is a really interesting one. And I think you've got other companies who've taken that husk and they're now putting into their biomass boilers. So now you've got that whole sustainability link back in. So if there could be more of those sorts of necessity inventions where not only does it improve quality, but it reduces your sustainability footprint, that also becomes really interesting.
And that's kind of a twofold message to consumers in a way. One, that you've closed the loop, so you're being more sustainable, and you've actually identified where there's some things that may create some off flavors in the beer. So you actually improve the beer quality as you're also doing other things that close the loop on sustainability. So, and we talked about it, of course, the chasing the consumer. Consumer is elusive and has quite varied taste. But if you can keep giving them a really good quality, fit for purpose, as John said many times, but really good quality and an experience that they can count on, I think that can only help, keeping people in the beer segment. And
then all of that for the purpose of, which I absolutely loved, was so you can have lip-smacking enthusiasm for a beer. And I think we all know that thing, we get an ice-cold beer, and I just think that is the best expression ever.
And really for a lager too, right? So a lip-smacking lager, and someone's going to have to market that because that's a marketing campaign all on its own.
I agree completely. Well, cheers to John and his lip-smacking enthusiasm for a good lager, and see you next week.
Yeah, all the best. Cheers.
Yes.